Well, we're just emerging from a couple of years of quarantine where folks who took the admonitions of the health officials seriously have isolated in their homes, sometimes with family, but if they didn't have family, they'd be completely alone. And we are seeing an epidemic of loneliness. So, Ben, we wanted to talk about this today because you and I hear this from time to time. People sometimes surrounded by people, but still feeling lonely.
Oh, yeah. I mean, loneliness is this one thing you hear, you see news reports on it, you see studies done on it. And not only that, just the anecdotal experiences that you and I have had talking with people of just people feeling lonely. And so we know that there's something going on right now, but how do we handle loneliness through our faith, and what does our faith have to say about loneliness? And so I think we need to understand what's going on when we're feeling this way, and how to handle what's going, because it does feel like after this pandemic, it has exacerbated this loneliness problem.
Yeah. So is there connection between your spiritual health and loneliness? I mean, shouldn't Jesus be enough? No.
Well, I do think that there is something we can learn with our faith, but the reality is there is something going on today in our world. I mean, usually it's the checkup, it's the fingers on the pulse where someone says, there's something wrong here. And the most recent studies of that certain health institutes have done, the most recent one in America found that 36% of Americans have felt frequently lonely. That's 1 in 3. It's 1 in 3 Americans. And the two most common groups to feel intense loneliness, this is interesting, but 18 to 25-year-olds are the 61%.
The most connected generation in the history of the human race.
61% of 18 to 25-year-olds are the ones that feel the most lonely. In fact, the younger you are, the more lonely you feel. They did this by generation. And you can just see the graph. And so 4 out of 10, 2 out of 5 Gen Zers feel lonely on at least weekly basis. Some feel, that daily, multiple times a week, and then at least weekly. But 4 out of 10 Gen Zers, loneliness is a chronic problem for them. So it's a major issue for younger people. But the second highest group of people that struggle with loneliness is mothers with young children. And I think that might make sense to us because they're taking care of kids all day long, and maybe they're just so busy with that age group. So about 51% of mothers with young children have bouts of loneliness, and then 61% of 18 to 25-year-olds. So and loneliness is a lot of times we think that loneliness is a merely emotional problem, but there's been enough studies done, Dan, that the biggest emotional problems that come out of loneliness are depression and anxiety. Those always increase when there's a sense of loneliness in someone. But there's actually studies that have been done that when people feel lonely, it actually leads to physical problems. There's heart disease and lung disease is impacted by loneliness. In fact, they say the more lonely you are, the more likely you are to die at a younger age.
Interesting.
And so this is a massive issue.
Is being alone and being lonely the same thing?
No.
Okay. What's the difference?
Because let's just be honest, Dan. You're an introvert.
Yes.
Right? And even as me as an extrovert, there's one time a week when I am ready to be alone. And you know what that time is?
Sunday after church?
Sunday afternoon. Sunday afternoon is the one time I'm like, okay, I'm right. I just want to be in my room. I want nothing to do. Here's what I do to be alone, Dan. I put in my AirPods. I line up a podcast, lineup of what I'm going to listen to for about 2 hours, and I get out a Sudoku book. And I just completely...
That sounds like torture to me on every level.
But to me, it's like I'm listening, but I'm doing something. It's either that or football. When football season's on, that's what I do. But no, look, just because you're alone, there's some people that love to be alone, right? I mean, you like to be alone at times.
I do. The thing is, sometimes and let's turn this into a Dan therapy session. I often feel like this. I'm around people all the time and sometimes feel very lonely.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why I asked the question, is the difference between being alone and being lonely? Because the thing I think many pastors crave, and pastors often are ones who say they're lonely, is that intimacy of it doesn't have to be a lot of people, but if there's just one or two people who get you.
Yeah.
So how does that impact?
Yeah, I think there's actually a psychological term they call attunement. And I think I've mentioned attunement before on this podcast. But the idea of attunement is every single person needs to have someone look into their eyes and say, I see you. How are you doing? Attunement is very crucial for children the first 6 months of their age. They need that constant eye-to-eye engagement, attunement from parents. And there's something about their brain development that is actually impacted by the greater the attunement a child gets, the more likely their brain is to fully develop. I mean, we see what we see what has happened in many of these communist or poor countries of children that they're in the cribs all day long.
Seen it with my own eyes.
Yeah,
yes.
I mean, it does something psychologically to them. We as human beings need to be seen, and we need to have that emotional eye-to-eye connection to say, I see you and I desire you, and how are you? And so attunement is one of those things that we can be around people all day long. We can be connected digitally to people all day. So that's why it's so interesting when you think about this generation that is supposedly so connected. They're on their digital devices for 12, at least 12 hours a day for most of them.
Right.
But yet, if they are not getting attunement from someone, they will feel lonely. And so one of the things in my study of this was really interesting, that the very same neural pathways or neural things that the neurons that light up in your brain, the same ones in your brain that light up when you are under intense physical pain are the same ones that light up when you're lonely. So loneliness is actually painful for people. Isn't that interesting?
It is.
And so this is not something like, you and I both grew up in generations where I'm lonely. Like, well, suck it up, buddy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? This is a real problem. And I think that we have to pay attention to this reality that we can't just say suck it up. There is something going on here that we need to pay attention to.
Well, fundamentally, I mean, this, again, always going back to the book of beginnings, we see the problem that Adam became lonely.
Yes.
And while he had fellowship with God, he needed that constant human presence in his life. And so God created Eve for him to be a companion. And from there, we've extrapolated the principle that God did not create us to be isolated, that we're supposed to be living in community.
I mean, if you think, okay, I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's a good transition point for us to bring in our faith, because it is good to know that God did not create us to be alone. And if you think about, let's go even prior to the garden, what do we have? We have the Trinitarian Godhead, which has perfect unity and community within the three persons of the Godhead, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And so God was never, I hate that this thing, God was lonely, so he decided to create human beings. Like that wasn't the case. God was never lonely.
Yeah, it implies that God has needs.
Yeah.
And God couldn't be
and
God
so,
and have needs.
But what God was doing in that moment, it's interesting when you look at the words in the first two chapters of Genesis. There's this word good, right? Like this introduction of good, that what God created was good. Then you have this introduction of evil, right? That so you have good and evil being introduced. But then you have this in chapter 2 when he's teaching Adam about what is good. It's categories of good and evil are easy for us to understand. But God creates a new category in chapter 2 when he says it is not good for man to be alone. It doesn't mean it's evil. It's just it's not good for man to be alone. And what he did was he brought Adam through a learning process to say, will you trust me to know that I can provide for you? And yes, Adam did have God. He did have that relationship of ultimate harmony and relationship with God personally. But he was teaching Adam that I don't want you to go through life by yourself. It's not good for a man to be alone. And then I don't want to diminish issues like people that are single or those kinds of things, because God can be very near and dear to us who are people who are single. But the point was, God created us for community. He created us for relationships. I love one of the Greek words that we use for fellowship. It's the word koinonia. It's this idea of I share my life with another person. And so you go back to the nature of God, the creation of mankind, God teaching mankind, like this is the way it's supposed to be. That God doesn't want us to be lonely. He wants us to experience love and community in ways that He wants to provide for us. And when we try to provide those things in our own ways, we always fall short. And so I just think that there's something that we've got to do to make sure that we are not falling into this trap of loneliness.
Yeah. So in light of that, what are proactive steps that we can take to address loneliness we may feel? Because a lot of times loneliness creates isolation.
Oh, absolutely.
And we self-isolate, and then it exacerbates it.
I want to I want to address two groups here. I want to address parents, and then I want to address people who are feeling lonely. Because I think as parents, it's if the reality is that the younger a child is, the more lonely they will feel, then I think parents need to have their radars up more than ever. And two of the findings of the studies that I researched, one was that loneliness in our nation doubled between 2012 and 2018.
Wow! Right as the internet hit,
as social media, there's a direct correlation between people feeling lonely and people getting on social media. Yeah, I mean, it is a. I don't think it's a correlation. I actually believe it's a causation. You know, there's a lot of times statistics there can be a correlation, but not necessarily causation. I do believe there's something that when the younger kids got on social media, they got those smartphones and they could be plugged into what everyone was doing. They all of a sudden felt a sense of, I'm not invited, or I'm not a part of all these groups. And so they started feeling lonely, or they would see other people's lives. And so it exacerbated the problem of loneliness, at least by double, because we know that loneliness doubled in that time. So I think it's important for parents to do a couple things. The first thing I would say is you need to make sure that you're communicating with your kids and asking these questions of, do you feel lonely? Make sure that you start at an age, usually around adolescence, when they're starting to be more aware of those things, and always just have that on your radar of how they're feeling in this way, because you might think I see them around people all the time. They go to school with other friends, or they're part of this co-op, or they go to church, and like, you would think they should be feeling fine, but you might be feeling like, oh, they're not doing well. Or if you see one of your kids starting to isolate, this happens to a lot of kids. The older they get, all of a sudden they start isolating. And I've talked to multiple parents where their kids have, they get their device, and all of a sudden they stay in the room all day long, and they don't feel like connecting. So they start doing things to create loneliness in their life. So I think as parents, you got to make sure that you get your fingers on your pulse with them. The next thing I would say is you've got to get your kids involved in a faith group of some kind. And when I say faith group, I don't mean just any group. There's lots of social groups out there. I think when parents is like, well, I got my kids in sports. Listen, your kid should be involved in a group that is not competition-based. Because whenever your kid is a part of a competition-based, there is something about teamwork and accomplishing a goal, which is good. But there are certain times when you don't want your kids to be on this pecking order of competition to make sure that, the pressure of performing, or I've got to beat out this person to get playing time. They don't need that kind of pressure. And so putting them in a faith group, church youth group, kid life, whatever it might be, they need to have a sense of belonging to a faith community. And so that and here's the thing, I know I've talked to so many parents about this. My kids don't want to go. Yeah. They don't know anyone. Well, listen, make a deal with them. Say, go 4 times. And after you go 4 times, you can make a choice. Absolutely. But give me 4 times going, because if they say, well, they tried it one time and they didn't enjoy it, you're never going to figure something out the first time. Yeah. And
when was the last time you heard a kid they don't want to do anything. They don't want to take a bath. They don't want to eat their vegetables. They want to go to school. They don't want to go to church. That's just part of their life.
Yeah. And so you got to be intentional with them in a church group, intentional with them being involved in other groups. And even what I would say is be intentional with finding a mentor for them. There's other voices that they need besides yours. And I think, another voice, whether it's a therapist or whether it's a mentor of some kind, that will spend time talking to them, listening to them, going through issues, is going to help resolve some of those loneliness issues. So the first thing I would say is, parents, you got to keep your fingers on the pulse of this. It's really important. But for those of us, you might be listening to this and say, okay, I get that. Kids might feel that, but I feel that. There are a couple of things I think we need to remember. And I think the first thing is, there's some real practical things we can do. And I think there are some spiritual things we can do. And so I want to start with the spiritual. And the first one is, we've got to remind ourselves of the truth of God's presence. And there's a plethora of scriptures. Matthew 28, the Great Commission, where the last thing Jesus says to disciples is, and lo, I will be with you always to the end of the age. You have Isaiah 41:10, where he promises his presence. You have Psalm 23, when you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, that God's presence will be with us. We have Psalm 139, where God talks about how he knows us. He knows us when we rise up and when we lie down. He hems us in behind him, before this idea of this intense presence of God. And that's just a handful of scriptures. But God, one of the biggest things that God wants us to know as his creation is, I am there and I am here. And you never have to feel like you're not being attuned to. Like, we always talk about that attunement, but God is attuned to us. And so we've got to remind ourselves, it doesn't matter how I feel. I have to recite and pray those things, and then pray them back to God. So not only declare the truth, but pray them back, and then spend time meditating and thinking about how God is present. Write down things that you've seen God do in your life and how he's shown up, his presence in your life before. But you have got to, this is the idea of, you have to practice the presence of God in your life, no matter what you feel. That's super important.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, the idea, and I think this is so important. Sometimes we don't hear the notes because of the noise. There are times when we need to appreciate solitude so that we can enjoy the community at a different level.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the dangers of social media, is we're surrounded by the noise, but we never appreciate the notes. We don't know these people. They're, TikToking and Instagramming, and it looks like their life is perfect, and, it's edited and filtered and everything else. But the constant noise keeps saying to us, you're not one of them, you're not cool, you're not popular, you're not blah, 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 blah. And we're never alone with the thought where God can speak to us through his word, where his Holy Spirit can comfort us and say, hey, but remember this, remember this. Right. And I think we've lost our joy in the solitude, and that leaves us even more lonely.
Yes.
So as you said earlier, and it may have been off microphone, but we're talking about the idea that some of us have a greater need for community than
Absolutely.
others.
Yeah.
And some of us are energized by being with people, others are drained. And so there's nuances. This isn't one size fits all.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, being able to connect with others and feel like, as you said, somebody cares, somebody sees you, somebody hears you.
Yes.
So what can we do if somebody in our life is in a lonely state?
Yeah, so there's a couple things just some practical things I think are important for us to remember. The first thing I would say is disrupt the pattern. Disrupt the pattern. If you feel alone or lonely, then what you've got to do is you've got to disrupt the pattern of thinking and the pattern of behavior. Disrupting the pattern of thinking is, many people that feel lonely, they're having constant pity parties for themselves. Oh, woe is me. No one attunes to me. No one attunes to me. And just stop being a victim. Yeah. Okay. I just said a full 1/3 of Americans feel alone frequently or feel lonely frequently. You're not alone. Yeah. Okay, so understand that 33% of the population out there is struggling with periods of loneliness. So stop the thought patterns of no one cares about me, no one loves me. So you've got to disrupt that, but you also have to disrupt the behaviors as well. So you got to look at how you're spending your time to say, what can I stop doing and start doing that's going to put me around other people?
And that may mean being radical. It may mean joining something,
Yes.
putting the phone down a
Yes.
certain number of hours
Yes.
or during certain periods of the day.
Absolutely. So, what I would say is one of the best things you can do to overcome loneliness, and this isn't just a biblical thing. I think you see secular people say this too. You have to commit to doing something for someone else beyond yourself.
So true. So true.
Like if all you're doing is wondering, when is someone going to pay attention to me? You're never going to win that battle of loneliness. You got to start volunteering, join a ministry at church, join a life community at church. You've got to say, I'm going to give my life to someone beyond myself. And so people that do that find out that they're not lonely anymore because they're so busy focusing on serving other people that they feel fulfilled inside. And so that would be the first one. The third thing I would say is you got to cut the digital cord. You got to set those limits. It's very easy to get on that phone or get on that iPad or get on that computer, whatever it might be, and you are on that for 12 hours scrolling or searching or watching or whatever it might be, and it's just like this drug that all of a sudden you get done with that at the end of the night and you're like, oh, I feel horrible.
Yeah. And it is like a drug. It's like eating potato chips for 3 hours.
And so you've got to do something to put boundaries around the times that you're spending, looking at someone's life and just saying, am I actually going to spend time with a physical person? Okay. And then the last suggestion I would have is start something. Start a group. Start. If you're saying I don't know anyone that has my similar interests, then start something like that. I think that if you're gonna wait around for someone to ask you to join, I think you're gonna miss out on a lot of things in life. And so take the initiative. Be bold and say, hey, I'm going to start a book club, a movie club every Friday night at my house. I'm going to invite whoever I know, and whether one person shows up or 10 people show up, we're going to do this.
Yep.
And so be bold and listen. Not everything you do is going to succeed.
Yep.
But work it until you resolve the issue. And I promise you this: there are enough people out there that are looking for connections, looking for friendships, looking for community, and you can be a catalyst for that.
Amen. Never expect other people to do for you what God has capably provided for you to be able to do for yourself.
Amen.
And so take these actions. Listen to the good advice Pastor Ben gave today. And if you're lonely on a Sunday morning, why don't you go to your church, right? And if you don't have a church,
Dan will hug you.
And I will hug you.
All you need to say is, Dan, I'm lonely, and Dan will hug you every Sunday morning.
Absolutely. We'd love to see you at Life Fellowship Church in Cornelius or wherever you live. Find a good church that preaches the Bible, and we'll love on you. As always, thanks for joining us for Life Talks, and until next time, we'll catch you then.